You say you want to move on. But tell me, why does your heart still race when your phone lights up? Why do you miss someone who shattered you? Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." So what if this pain isn't about love, but about a truth you've buried? This isn't just another video. This is a mirror. And what you're about to see may hurt, but it might be the only thing that finally sets you free. What if I told you, the person you're trying to let go of was never really them? Not the real them, but the version your unconscious mind created. A symbol, a screen, a vessel for everything you've lost, everything you were denied, everything you were taught to bury. Carl Jung believed that when we fall in love, or when we become obsessed with someone who hurts us, we're often not relating to the actual person at all. We're relating to a projection, a psychological phantom stitched together by our unmet needs, our childhood wounds, and our forgotten self. You weren't just loving them, you were loving what they represented. Maybe they made you feel seen in a way no one else ever had. Maybe they were emotionally unavailable, like a parent you could never reach. Maybe they were chaotic, inconsistent, magnetic, and something in you, something buried, felt at home in that chaos, felt needed, felt familiar. But familiarity doesn't mean safety. It just means repetition. And repetition is the language of trauma. See, the unconscious is a strange architect. It builds your reality not based on what you want, but on what you've survived. And if you survived emotional neglect, rejection, abandonment, or manipulation, it will continue to recreate those dynamics until you finally confront them. This is the tragedy behind most toxic attachments. You think you're fighting for love, but you're really fighting for psychological recognition, for your younger self to finally be chosen. That's why letting go feels impossible, because to let go isn't just to lose a person, it's to lose the fantasy they carried, the unconscious hope that this time you could rewrite the story. But that story was never real. It was written with the ink of illusion on the paper of your pain. And here's where the false self comes in, the persona Jung spoke of. You shaped yourself around this person, around their needs, their moods, their validations. You twisted, shrank, overgave, not because you're weak, but because you were trying to be loved in the only way you knew how, by disappearing. You mistook sacrifice for connection. You called it love when it was self-abandonment. And now you feel hollow, confused, addicted, not to the person, but to the version of yourself that felt momentarily worthy in their presence. You weren't addicted to love. You were addicted to the version of you that came alive in their eyes. That moment when they finally looked at you, when they touched the place in you that always felt invisible, it was electric, felt sacred, but what you didn't see was the cost. Every time you made yourself smaller just to be enough for them, every time you silenced your truth just to keep their presence, you were making a trade, one that your soul couldn't afford. And the most brutal part? You knew, deep down, that it was never going to last. But part of you was willing to burn just to feel warm for a little longer. This is the false self in action. Jung called it the persona, the social mask we wear to survive. It's the version of you that's palatable, likable, safe. But the more you depend on that mask, the more estranged you become from your essence. And in toxic relationships, this estrangement becomes a prison. You bend until you break, hoping that your loyalty will finally earn you the love you've always craved. But here's the truth. No amount of love from another person can replace the love you've never given yourself. What you called connection was often just survival. What you called passion was often just reenactment. And what you're still calling love is, perhaps, a desperate search for the parts of you that were never allowed to exist. You see, Jung didn't view emotional suffering as random. He saw it as meaningful, as symbolic. Pain isn't just pain. It's information. It's your unconscious trying to wake you up, trying to show you that the pattern isn't love. It's a loop, and you're stuck in it because somewhere along the way, you learned that love was earned through pain. But it's not. Real love, the kind that heals, doesn't require you to disappear. And now comes the hardest part. Letting go, not just of the person, but of the story, the projection, the illusion that they were ever your salvation. Because they weren't. They were a mirror, and the reflection you saw was you. The parts you lost, the parts you missed, the parts you're finally being asked to reclaim. This is where the real healing begins. Not with closure from them, but with confrontation with yourself. You know it's hurting you. You know it's over, maybe it was never even real. And yet, part of you still waits, still hopes, still aches. Why? Because you're not just trying to forget a person. You're trying to unlearn a pattern that's been written into your nervous system since childhood. Carl Jung said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. And sometimes the absurd thing is clinging to someone who keeps wounding you. But this isn't stupidity. This isn't weakness. This is emotional addiction. And like any addiction, it isn't about pleasure. It's about relief. Relief from the void. Relief from the silence. Relief from having to face yourself. See, emotional addiction doesn't start with them. It starts with how your psyche was shaped. If, as a child, you learned that love came with conditions, that you had to perform, please, shrink, or suffer just to feel worthy, then your nervous system encoded pain as part of connection. You grew up chasing approval that always stayed just out of reach. And now, as an adult, you call that chase romance. That's why you mistake anxiety for passion. Why inconsistency feels intoxicating. Why you feel more alive in chaos than in calm. Because chaos is what your body recognizes. It's familiar. And in the unconscious mind, familiarity feels like home, even if home was hell. So when someone triggers those old wounds by being distant, unpredictable, critical, your trauma brain lights up. Not because you enjoy suffering, but because suffering feels like a path back to love. A pattern you were trained to walk. It's not the person you can't let go of. It's the identity you built around being the one who stays, the one who saves, the one who earns love through pain. That's why closure doesn't work. That's why logic fails. You're not dealing with logic, you're dealing with emotional circuitry carved by years of unmet needs. And here's the painful irony. The more they hurt you, the deeper the bond becomes. It's called a trauma bond. The brain confuses intensity for intimacy. You start to believe that suffering is proof of how deeply you care. But it's not love. It's repetition. You stay not because it feels good, but because it feels familiar. And the familiar always wins, until you wake up. Carl Jung warned us that what we do not make conscious will return as fate. This is what he meant. The people you attract, the chaos you tolerate, the patterns you repeat. None of it is accidental. It is your unconscious trying to resolve the unresolved, trying to finish the unfinished story of your life. And that story often begins in the places where you were first unloved. Here's the truth. When you've built your self-worth around being needed, desired, or validated by someone else, losing them doesn't just feel like grief. It feels like annihilation. You're not just mourning the loss of a relationship. You're mourning the self you became inside that relationship. The role you played, the identity you wore, the fantasy you fed. That's why no contact feels like death. That's why silence feels unbearable. Because it forces you to confront the one person you've been avoiding all along, yourself. But this is also the opportunity, the rupture, the beginning of freedom. Because the only way to stop seeking your reflection in someone else's eyes is to turn inward and meet your own gaze. This is the real work, the inner alchemy Jung spoke of. To stop looking for wholeness in the arms of those who fracture you. To stop calling it fate when it's really just your shadow in disguise. Letting go of someone who hurts you is not just about cutting contact. It's about rewiring your psyche. about giving up the identity of the one who was abandoned and stepping into the power of the one who chooses to walk away. And yes, it will hurt. It will feel like you're dying. But maybe that's exactly what needs to happen. Not the death of love, but the death of illusion. So that what is real, your self-worth, your clarity, your wholeness, can finally live. You think you're making choices, but most of the time, it's not really you who's choosing. It's your shadow. That silent, hidden part of you. The part you've disowned. The part you've buried. The part that still bleeds beneath the surface of your smile. Carl Jung defined the shadow as everything you refuse to see about yourself. The impulses you repress, the pain you ignore, the truths you're afraid to admit. But just because you deny it doesn't mean it disappears. It waits. And its favorite playground? Relationships. This is the trap. You keep falling for people who reflect the very parts of yourself you've been running from. You call it fate. You call it chemistry. You call it love. But it's not love. It's recognition, twisted, inverted, unconscious. You hate in them what you can't accept in yourself. You crave in them what you've lost in yourself. You cling to them not because they are whole, but because they mirror the places where you are fractured. Have you noticed the pattern? The emotionally unavailable ones. The ones who make you feel small, unseen, disposable. They keep reappearing, don't they? Different faces, same wounds. This isn't coincidence. This is your shadow pulling the strings. Because deep down, there's a belief buried so deep you barely know it's there that says, I don't deserve more than this. Maybe you were taught to suppress your anger, so you fall for people who embody it and hurt you with it. Maybe you were taught that your needs were too much, so you attach to people who neglect them and you call that strength. Maybe you were never given unconditional love, so you keep chasing conditional love, hoping this time it will be different. But it never is. Because the script hasn't changed, only the actors. You don't repeat this pattern because you enjoy suffering. You repeat it because your psyche is trying to resolve it, trying to bring the shadow into the light. And this is where the danger lies. The longer you avoid confronting what lives inside you, the louder it echoes through your life. The more you deny your anger, the more you attract those who provoke it. The more you repress your desire to be seen, the more invisible you become in love. Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And isn't that exactly what's been happening? You've called it fate. You've called it bad luck. You've blamed yourself, them, the universe. But you haven't turned inward. Not fully. Not yet. And until you do, until you look into the mirror and face the parts of you you were told to hate, this cycle won't stop. You'll keep falling for versions of your own wound. You'll keep rewriting the same chapter, hoping for a different ending. You'll keep begging to be chosen by people who reflect the very parts of you you've never chosen yourself. This is the shadow's trap. It disguises itself as longing, as passion, as fate. But it's really a cry for integration. Because the moment you stop rejecting those buried parts, your rage, your hunger, your grief, your unmet needs, you stop needing someone else to carry them for you. You stop projecting. You stop chasing. You stop confusing pain with purpose. And in that moment, something radical happens. You begin to choose differently. Not because you've become colder, but because you've become whole. And the shadow? It no longer drives the car. It rides beside you, acknowledged, integrated, and no longer in control. There comes a moment, after the breaking, after the grief, after the long dark of unknowing, when you realize something. You can't go back. Not to the relationship. Not to who you were in it. Not to the version of yourself that made pain a home. And that moment is terrifying. Because the mask is gone, but your real face hasn't fully returned. You are between selves, untethered, raw, exposed. But this is the turning point. This is what Jung called the beginning of individuation, the slow, fierce becoming of who you really are. Individuation is not self-improvement. It's not healing to be more likable or fixing yourself to be more acceptable. It's the opposite. It's the act of reclaiming the parts of you that were exiled. It's the decision to stop betraying yourself for love. It starts with a question, a brutal one. What have I been abandoning in myself just to be chosen? And when you answer that, when you stop making yourself smaller just to fit into someone else's arms, you begin the path of psychological sovereignty. This isn't a pretty process. It's not clean. You will feel grief, anger, emptiness. You'll look in the mirror and not recognize who's staring back, because for so long, you were only ever seen through someone else's eyes. But slowly, painfully, you begin to come back. Not to who you were, but to who you were before you had to survive. This is where the fragments start to return. The voice you silenced begins to speak again. The boundaries you broke for love begin to harden, not from bitterness, but from integrity. You stop reaching for their validation. You stop needing their attention to feel real. You begin to stand inside your own skin, fully, fiercely, unapologetically. This is what self-possession looks like. Not a life without pain, but a life no longer ruled by it. Not a heart without longing, but a heart that no longer begs. You realize that the real loss was never them. The real loss was you. Every time you said yes when you wanted to say no, every time you stayed silent when your soul was screaming. And now you start to reclaim that. You start saying no. You stop explaining your worth. You begin walking away from anything, anyone that requires you to betray yourself just to be close. That's not selfishness. That's clarity. And it's here, in this reclamation, that the wound becomes a doorway. That the loss becomes a teacher. That the ending becomes the beginning, not of another desperate love story, but of your return to yourself. Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And maybe that's what this was all for. Not to make you happy, but to make you whole. Letting go is not weakness. It's not failure. It's not giving up. Letting go is alchemy, the moment when pain is no longer just something that happened to you, but something that transforms you. But let's not pretend it's easy. You're not just letting go of a person. You're letting go of a future that never happened. Of a version of love you imagined. Of a self you shaped around the dream of being loved back. That grief is real. It deserves mourning. It deserves reverence. Because when you let go of someone who hurt you, you're not just saying goodbye to them. You're saying goodbye to the illusions they carried, and to the part of you that clung to those illusions like a lifeline. Carl Jung understood this. He knew that the unconscious must be made conscious, and that means facing your losses not with bitterness, but with brutal honesty. It means admitting, I loved with everything I had, I hoped beyond reason, and now I release it, not because it didn't matter, but because it mattered too much to keep holding what is already gone. This is sacred. This is powerful. Because to release what was never truly yours is to reclaim what always was you. Letting go is not forgetting. It's not pretending it didn't hurt. It's standing at the grave of a version of your life and choosing, with trembling hands, to walk away without dragging the corpse behind you. It's knowing that no apology, no explanation, no perfect closure will undo what was done. But it doesn't have to. Because closure isn't something they give you, it's something you claim. In the silence, in the solitude, in the decision to live fully, even with a heart that still remembers. This is how you begin again. Not by erasing the past, but by honoring it and no longer being bound by it. You stop waiting. You stop chasing. You stop asking someone to make you feel what only you can give yourself. Worth, peace, wholeness. Letting go becomes your rebellion, your resurrection, Your return. Carl Jung said, your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakens. And that's what this is. An awakening. You're not who you were. You're not who they said you were. You are something else entirely now, forged in pain but not defined by it. So write this in the comments. I choose self-possession. Not as a wish but as a vow. Because no one else is coming to save you. And finally, you've stopped waiting.